We are taught to think of history as something complete. A set of agreed facts arranged in a straight line, cleanly labeled, safely distant. In school, the past arrives like a finished map, neat borders, clear dates, and a simple story of progress from primitive to modern. It feels settled, it feels final, and because the story is familiar, we rarely notice how much of it is built on interpretation rather than certainty. But history is not a sealed vault. It is a reconstruction assembled from fragments that survive by accident, bones that did not decay, stones that did not crumble, writings that were not burned, and places that were not built over. Every piece we hold is a clue, and every clue must be translated, and translation is never perfect. It depends on methods, assumptions, and the limits of the tools we use to measure time and meaning. So the real question is not whether historians lie, or whether every textbook is wrong. The real question is simpler and more unsettling. How much do we mistake a useful narrative for a complete one? Because official history has a job to do. It has to be teachable, it has to be stable. It has to fit inside a curriculum, inside a museum label, inside the human need for order. And when the evidence is messy, when it refuses to align, the temptation is not always to rewrite everything. More often, it is to simplify, to explain away, to isolate the problem, to mark it as an exception and move on. There is nothing inherently sinister in that. Simplification is how humans handle complexity. But simplification has a cost, and sometimes a cost is paid in silence, in discarded reports, in anomalies filed away, and in questions that never make it past the margin. The first place the story begins to bend is the timeline itself. We speak of ancient history in precise numbers: 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 40,000 years. We treat dates like anchors, but in archaeology and geology, a date is rarely a single point. It is a range, it is a probability, and it is only as reliable as the method and the context. Radiocarbon dating, for example, is one of the most famous techniques. It works because living things constantly take in carbon from the environment. A small portion of that carbon is radioactive carbon-14, formed in the atmosphere and absorbed into plants and animals. While an organism is alive, its carbon-14 level stays roughly in balance with the environment. When it dies, the intake stops, and the carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate. By measuring how much remains, scientists estimate how long it has been since death. It sounds straightforward, and it can be extraordinarily powerful. But it is not a magic clock. Radiocarbon dating does not date stones or metals directly. It dates organic material, charcoal, bone collagen, wood fibers, seeds. And the moment you rely on organic material, you rely on something that can be contaminated, moved, reused, or mixed with older and younger carbon. A piece of wood can be far older than the structure it ends up in. A beam reused from a previous building can give an old date for a newer construction. This is known as the old wood problem, and it is not rare. Contamination can also skew results. Groundwater can introduce younger carbon. Conservation chemicals applied by early excavators can alter samples. Even the environment itself matters. Marine organisms can appear artificially old because they take in carbon from ocean reservoirs that have different carbon-14 levels than the atmosphere. That is called the reservoir effect, and correcting for it requires careful calibration. Calibration is its own reminder that timekeeping is not simple. Carbon-14 levels in the atmosphere have not been constant over millennia. Solar activity, Earth's magnetic field, and industrial emissions all affect it. So raw radiocarbon dates must be calibrated using other records, such as tree rings, which provide annual growth layers that can be counted and matched across regions. Calibration improves accuracy, but it also makes something clear. Even our best dating methods depend on models, and models depend on assumptions. Stratigraphy is another foundational method. In its simplest form, it relies on the principle of superposition in an undisturbed sequence of layers. The deeper layers are older, and the higher layers are younger. It is a powerful logic, and in many contexts it holds, but the Earth is not always orderly. Layers can be disturbed by erosion, earthquakes, burrowing animals, roots, floods, landslides, and human digging across time. A tool can fall into an older layer through a crack. A burial can cut through straighter, placing younger material deeper. A river can redeposit older sediments above newer ones. Then there are methods like potassium-argon dating and argon-argon dating used to date volcanic layers, helpful for very ancient timelines. These can anchor sequences beyond the reach of radiocarbon, but they depend on proper context and assumptions about when a mineral cooled and trapped gases. If the sample is altered or the geological history is more complex than assumed, results can conflict. And conflict does happen. In real excavations, it is not unusual for different methods to produce different ranges. Sometimes the disagreement is small, sometimes it is large enough to be uncomfortable. When that happens, researchers do not simply accept the most dramatic number. They investigate contamination, sampling error, stratigraphic disturbance, calibration issues. This is science doing what it should do, but here is the quieter point. When results do not fit expectations, the first instinct is often to treat the result as the problem rather than the model. Not because of malice, but because models are expensive. Models are careers. Models are institutional memory. A timeline is not just a line, it is the backbone of thousands of interpretations. So in practice, what tends to happen is that the timeline is adjusted carefully in ways that preserve overall structure. Outlier dates are explained as contamination, odd contexts are marked as disturbed. Uncomfortable results are described as requiring further study, and then they wait. And waiting can be a form of forgetting. From there, we enter the world of artifacts that do not belong in their time. Sometimes these are sensational claims, and many deserve skepticism. Archaeology has seen genuine hoaxes and misinterpretations, but not every anomaly is fraud. Some are simply hard to classify, hard to publish, or too uncertain to defend in a field that demands caution. An artifact can appear impossible for several reasons. It may be misdated, it may have been found without proper documentation. It may have been removed from its original context by natural forces, or it may be real evidence of something we have not fully explained, an unusual local innovation, a forgotten technique, a trade network earlier than expected, or a cultural capacity underestimated by modern assumptions. Consider how often the official story treats ancient people as limited by the simplest version of their tools. We imagine their lives through a narrow set of surviving objects, and we assume that what did not survive did not exist, but organic technologies vanish. Textiles rot, wood decays, leather collapses into dust. Complex systems of measurement, planning, and engineering can leave only stone footprints behind. And when a stone footprint looks too precise, too large, or too sophisticated, the reflex is often to reduce it to something comfortable. A striking pattern appears in the language used to handle these moments. Objects become ritual when their function is unclear. Structures become symbolic when their practicality challenges expectations. Precision becomes coincidence when it is difficult to explain, or when acknowledging it would imply a level of planning that does not fit the standard picture. Sometimes an artifact is not disputed for what it is, but for what it implies. If a tool appears in a layer believed to be too old for that kind of human presence, it presses on an entire migration model. If a structure suggests coordinated labor earlier than expected, it presses on the story of how and when societies became complex. If metallurgy, geometry, or long-distance transport appears too early, it forces a question that is costly: are our phases too rigid? And so these finds can become isolated. They are treated as singular, local, non-representative. They are discussed in technical circles, if at all, but rarely become part of the public story. Not because the public cannot handle nuance, but because nuance is harder to package than certainty. A clean narrative is easier to sell than an unfinished investigation. The public receives history as certainty, Researchers live in history as probability. Nowhere is this more visible than in the way excavation itself is controlled. The past is not evenly distributed across the earth, and it is not equally accessible. Many of the most important sites are in places where politics, religion, security, and economics collide. Some locations sit under modern cities. Some are protected, and protection is necessary because sites can be destroyed quickly by looting and development. Some are genuinely dangerous to access, some are contested territory. Some are part of living religious landscapes, where digging is not just a scientific act, but a cultural provocation. It is easy to imagine restricted excavations as a deliberate effort to hide the truth. Reality is usually less theatrical and more human. Governments may restrict sites because artifacts are national property and a symbol of identity. Religious authorities may resist excavation near sacred areas. Institutions may limit access because a site is fragile, because they lack funds, or because they fear uncontrolled tourism will cause irreversible damage. Sometimes restrictions are bureaucratic. Sometimes they are political, sometimes they are both at once. But whatever the reason, control over a site becomes control over what can be claimed about it. Archaeology is not just about what is found. It is about who is allowed to dig, who is allowed to publish, who owns the artifacts, and who decides what counts as credible. There are also silent zones created not by law, but by time, excavations that begin and then stall. Sites that produce an early burst of attention and then decades of delay. Warehouses filled with unevaluated material because cataloging and analysis take years, and funding cycles do not reward slow work. In many parts of the world, there are more artifacts than there are specialists to study them. There are boxes of pottery, bones, and tools waiting for their turn to be measured, compared, and understood. And in that waiting space, narratives harden without them. The public often imagines discovery as a dramatic moment, the brush, the reveal, the news headline. But the real act of archaeology is long and technical. It is context. It is soil chemistry. It is microscopic analysis. It is cautious wording. It is peer review, which can be a safeguard against error, and also, at times, a filter against disruption. A claim that challenges established interpretations must be defended with extraordinary rigor, and that rigor is fair. But it also creates an environment where researchers may hesitate to pursue interpretations that could make them look reckless. So the simplest explanations win, not because they are always true, but because they are safer. This brings us to one of the most important contrasts in the study of the past, the difference between evidence and interpretation. Evidence is what is physically there, the stone blocks, the cut marks on bones, the chemical traces in soil, the distribution of artifacts, the layers of ash. Interpretation is the story we build to connect those pieces into a coherent account. The official version of history often presents interpretation as if it were evidence. This was a temple. This was a royal tomb. This tool was used for hunting. These may be reasonable conclusions, supported by patterns and comparisons, but they are still conclusions. And when a conclusion becomes repeated enough, it begins to sound like a fact. Over time, the boundary blurs. The public forgets that interpretation can change with new methods, new finds, and new questions. Sometimes the observed evidence is stubborn. A structure is aligned in ways that suggest careful planning. A quarry is far from the building site, implying transport and organization. Cut stones fit with precision that demands either skill, time, or a method we do not fully understand from surviving tools alone. This does not require fantasies, it requires only humility. Ancient people were not vague silhouettes. They were intelligent, persistent, and capable of problem-solving over generations. Yet official explanations often choose the minimum disruption. If something can be explained with simple labor, it will be. If something can be framed as accidental, it will be. If a complex possibility threatens to unravel a tidy sequence, it will be postponed until more evidence appears. And that postponement can last a very long time. So why does this matter today? Because history is not just entertainment. It is a foundation for identity. Nations use history to justify borders and belonging. Cultures use history to define origins and values. Individuals use history to understand where they stand in the long human story. When history is presented as a straight line of progress, we absorb that line into our assumptions about the future. We begin to believe that civilization always moves forward, that complexity only increases, that knowledge accumulates smoothly. But the evidence of human history suggests something more cyclical, more fragile. Societies rise, flourish, and fall. Skills can be lost, networks can collapse. Trade routes can vanish, populations can move. Environmental shifts can reshape entire regions. The past is filled with interruptions. If our picture of ancient capability is too narrow, we may misunderstand what humans can build under pressure, with limited resources, and with long time horizons. If our picture of ancient collapse is too simplified, we may underestimate how quickly stability can unravel. And if we treat the past as fully known, we may ignore warning signs that earlier societies faced: drought, soil depletion, political fragmentation, disease, and the slow erosion of trust. An incomplete past leads to overconfident futures. This is not an argument for rejecting mainstream history. It is an argument for remembering what mainstream history really is: the best current synthesis of evidence, filtered through methods, institutions, and human limits. It is a living model, not a sacred script, and it is worth noticing what kinds of discoveries become central and what kinds become peripheral. When an object fits, it is taught. When it does not, it becomes a footnote. When a date aligns, it is repeated. When it conflicts, it is questioned until it can be made to align, or until it can be safely labeled uncertain. When a site is open, it becomes a destination. When it is restricted, it becomes a blank space in the public imagination, filled with speculation, even when the real reason is mundane. Yet those blank spaces matter because curiosity gathers around silence. And silence in the study of the past is rarely empty. It is often full of unfinished work. Perhaps the most honest way to think about history is to imagine it not as a completed book, but as an archive in constant motion. Pages are missing, pages are damaged, some pages are misfiled. Others are written in languages we cannot yet read. Every new method is a new lens. Every new excavation is a new paragraph. And sometimes a single new discovery forces a chapter to be rewritten. So the question is not, what are they hiding? The question is, what are we overlooking? What assumptions are we protecting because they make the story easier to teach? What anomalies are we ignoring because they are difficult to explain? What evidence have we placed outside the main narrative because it complicates the line? History feels finished because we prefer it that way. Closure is comforting. A clean timeline gives the mind something to hold. But the Earth does not offer clean timelines. It offers fragments, layers, and contradictions. And when we finally admit that, something changes. The past becomes more than a sequence of dates. It becomes a vast investigation that we are still inside of. A reminder that knowledge is provisional, that certainty is rare, and that the most important discoveries are often not the ones that confirm what we already believe, but the ones that quietly refuse to fit. Maybe that is the history they never tell us. Not a secret story locked away, but a deeper truth about how history is made, that the past is not a closed book. That some pages remain unread because they are hard to reach, hard to interpret, or hard to reconcile. And that the most responsible stance is not suspicion, but patience and precision, paired with an open mind. Because the real mystery is not that official history simplifies. The real mystery is how much complexity has survived at all, scattered across deserts and seabeds, buried under cities, sealed in caves, waiting in storage rooms, and resting in layers that no one has had the time or funding to study properly. If we listen carefully, the past does not speak in a single voice. It speaks in echoes, in partial sentences, in interrupted stories. And sometimes in the places where the official version grows quiet, the unanswered questions begin.
Let me start with a question. If the city you live in vanished tomorrow, what would remain for someone to find 1,000 years from now? The answer is already under your feet. Because whether you live in Istanbul, Mexico City, London, Rome, or a quiet town with a very old church and a strangely high sidewalk, we are already walking across the roofs of older worlds. We live on the ruins of the ancient world, not metaphorically, but physically. The modern city is a stack, and our floor is not the first one laid. Cities don't replace themselves the way forests do. Forests burn, then regrow from soil raw and new. Cities burn, flood, crumble, and then we build on top, using the old as foundation, filler, or a forgettable basement. This is why front doors in medieval streets sometimes open onto staircases that plunge down to a doorway buried a story below the sidewalk. It's why basements in some neighborhoods have windows that stare into earth. It's why archaeologists talk about cultural layers as if a city were a cake. Today, we'll explore 3 hooks that make this idea vivid: buried floors, underground cities, and sudden cultural layers that feel like catastrophe. And we'll ask what this vertical city does to our sense of time. Start with the humble doorway. In Rome, you can visit the medieval church of San Clemente. Step inside, and you'll feel the timeline tilt. Beneath the 12th century church is a 4th century church. Beneath that, a 1st century Mithraic shrine. 3 stories of worship, one stacked on another, and the oldest is now underground, simply because time dropped silt, floods rose, rubble filled, and people wanted flat floors again. This isn't just Rome. In Istanbul, street level climbed over centuries of fires, earthquakes, and rebuilding. In many historic neighborhoods, you can find ground floor shops with ceilings suspiciously low, or doors that used to be ground level but now open onto a waist-high wall. The city rose, the door sank. And then there's London's Mithraeum, a Roman temple to Mithras lost beneath the financial district. When it was rediscovered during 20th century construction, it hadn't teleported. It was exactly where it had always been. It's the surface that moved grain by grain, brick by broken brick, lifted by flood deposits, demolition fill, and centuries of resurfacing streets. Why do floors get buried? Think sediment and reuse. Ancient streets, especially in river cities, received regular doses of silt from floods. After fires or sieges, rubble was swept into low spots or used as fill. When wood decayed, when walls collapsed, when civic projects regraded a slope, the ground climbed never dramatically in a day, but relentlessly over lifetimes. If you wanted to raise a flood-prone neighborhood, the cheapest way was to dump yesterday's broken city under tomorrow's market square. The street got higher. The old doorway went dark. If you've ever wondered why basements have vaulted brick ceilings in some old quarters, consider this. Those were once open-air arches, later entombed when the street above was lifted. You are walking across yesterday's skyline. Sometimes the old city isn't just below. The city below is intentional. In central Turkey, under the volcanic landscapes of Cappadocia, entire underground cities such as Derinkuyu and Kaymak descend like beehives into the earth. These were not basements in our sense. They were layered sanctuaries. People carved kitchens, stables, sleeping chambers, wineries, and churches into soft tuff, complete with rolling stone doors that sealed tunnels. They could hide thousands of people for weeks. The city below here is not an accident of time, it's an architecture of survival. Seattle offers a different, more recent example. After an 1889 fire destroyed much of the downtown, the city rebuilt a level higher to fix chronic flooding and sewage problems. Streets were regraded upward by as much as 22 feet. For a time, pedestrians walked on elevated sidewalks while shopkeepers still used their ground floors below. Eventually, the lower level was sealed and dimmed. Today, Seattle's underground is a guided tour through what used to be the city's daylight. In Paris, the underground is a mirror of the above-ground, quarries, catacombs, sewers, and the metro. The catacombs, filled with millions of human bones relocated from overcrowded cemeteries in the 18th and 19th centuries, are not a ruin in the usual sense, but a restacked city of the dead. A stone that built Parisian boulevards was quarried beneath them. Walk a Paris street and you stand on the source of its own walls. Underground city is not just romance. It's infrastructure. Subways and service tunnels, culverted rivers, service corridors, and sky-blue water mains, then older brick sewers beneath. A city is nested architecture. Sometimes the deepest level is ancient. Sometimes the deepest level is the newest steel rails and cables punched through old clay and medieval refuse. Either way, the vertical image persists. We live in one layer, aware or unaware of the others. Most layers accumulate slowly, but some arrive all at once. Archaeologists call them event deposits, an ash blanket from a volcano, a tsunami sand sheet, a citywide demolition layer after an invasion or after urban renewal. Pompeii is the emblem. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, and the lethal mix of falling pumice and pyroclastic flows froze the city in a few hours. Walk the streets today, and you can see bread in ovens, graffiti on walls, a dog's chain coiled against stone. It feels like a catastrophe pressed pause on a civilization and left a cast for us to pour plaster into. Another Bronze Age city, Acroterion Santorini, was similarly sealed by an earlier eruption, a frescoed world held in volcanic chalk. But sudden layer doesn't have to mean lava. In the Near East, Tell's mounds formed by millennia of occupation sometimes reveal black bands of burned debris. A city fell in a night, and ash became a line on the stratigraphy. In England, the Great Fire Layer from 1666 is a widespread horizon of charcoal and melted pottery across London's archaeological record. There are modern sudden layers, too, created not by disaster but by decision. In the 19th century, Baron Haussmann's redesign of Paris cut boulevards through dense medieval streets. Debris became fill elsewhere. In many cities, 20th century slum clearance created new, flat platforms for highways and towers. The effect is the same on the ground. An abrupt horizon, a line that says, before this, one world, after this, another. This is the feeling I want to put words to. You look at a single band of ash or a single buried street, and it seems like an entire layer of civilization was wiped clean in an instant. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's how we interpret a long story compressed into a thin layer. Either way, the sensation is of standing above a vanished city you can almost touch. Let's make this concrete. Imagine a river city. Year 0, a market square lies a little above the river. Timber-framed buildings line a dirt street. Year 10, a flood leaves 2 inches of silt. People shovel doorways clear, but the street is now slightly higher. Year 35, a fire destroys 1 block. Rubble fills cellars and smooths the street. New structures go up on the compacted debris. Year 60, the city paves the road with stone. A flat surface demands flat thresholds. Owners add steps up from their now lower floors or raise their interiors to match. Year 120, another flood, another inch or 2 of silt. The city adds new paving on top rather than peeling off the old. The curb grows taller. Year 200, sewers are installed. To get the right slope, the street is raised. Basement windows become coal chutes. What used to be ground floors become basements. Year 350, a planner straightens the street and levels the slope. Retaining walls hold in new fill. Sidewalks ride higher. The old street, locked below, dry and forgotten. Multiply this by neighborhoods and centuries. Add the habit of using ruins as quarries for new building stone, and you have the vertical city we live in, Rome. Layers on layers. Forums turned into cow pastures in the Middle Ages, then buried under debris, then re-excavated as the birth of archaeology. The Colosseum's arena floor? Below the modern gaze, the hypogeum tunnels and cages was a basement even in antiquity. Mexico City. The Templo Mayor of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, lay under the colonial city for centuries, parceled and built over. Excavations in the late 20th century revealed offerings, serpents carved in stone, layers of ritual construction, each Aztec phase built atop the previous now beneath asphalt and offices. London. The city's Roman layer sits meters down roads, mosaics, the Walbrook Stream culvert. The Great Fire Horizon is a black seam at 17th century depth. On top of that, the Victorians erased and rewrote ground levels when they modernized sewers, then raised embankments along the Thames. Istanbul. Constantine's city is threaded with Byzantine cisterns, many now under shops and streets. The Basilica cistern with its forest of columns. Above them, Ottoman neighborhoods rose and burned and rose again, each reconstruction packing the ground a little higher. Naples, the Greco-Roman aqueducts and tufa quarries became World War II air raid shelters. Today, guides lower you into a subterranean mirror of the old city water channels, cisterns, staircases under the grid of Spanish quarters. Jerusalem, a city of vertical truths. Streets from the Roman era lie beneath medieval souk. Tunnels along the western wall show stones placed by Herodian builders, now far below modern pavement. In each city, the past is repeatedly reused, and when reuse is impractical, we bury and build. There's a peculiar emotion that cultural layers provoke. You stand at the edge of a trench and see bright pottery above, bright pottery below, and between them a thin blackness char. It looks like a night that never ended. It feels as if a whole world ended in a breath. Sometimes it did. A volcanic ash layer that stretches across a region is a synchronized clock hand. But sometimes the feeling of catastrophe comes from compression. Decades of decline and repair can shrink into one dirty, compacted seam, and our eyes read suddenness because the layer is thin. A sudden cultural layer can be a psychological effect. Thinness equals instantness. Archaeology makes us more careful. We ask, was it a night of fire or a generation of neglect? Either way, the vertigo is real. We are up here on the fresh pavement. They are down there, just an arm's reach into the past, inhabiting kitchens that still smell of smoke when the earth opens. Living above ruins shapes memory. Legends often begin in basements. A saint's bones under the altar, a hidden synagogue beneath a house, a tunnel that leads to the castle. Sometimes the legend is true in spirit. There's a Roman road beneath. There's also the ethics of building on bones. When we treat the past as fill, we risk flattening more than topography. But when we treat it as sacred, we risk turning cities into museums. The vertical city asks for balance. Keep the subway moving. Keep the door open to the older room. And maybe most of all, it asks humility. We are not the first floor. We are just the current one. You don't need a ruin to see the stack. Here's how to read it where you live. Look for doors below sidewalks. A window half buried is a past ground floor. Check churchyards and old civic buildings. Are there thresholds far above the street? The ground rose around them. Find sudden steps inside old shops. An interior slope often marks where a new street level forced a floor lift. Trace old waterways on maps. Culverted streams are often under odd street curves or long, narrow parks. And when you pass a construction pit, look at the walls. Bands of color, debris, and soil are the city's barcode. Every city has a stratigraphy. Learning to read, it is learning to feel time in the solace of your shoes. We live on the ruins of the ancient world, and the future will live on ours. Someday, someone will descend into a cooled subway tunnel, find the tiled station name, and run a gloved hand across a timetable frozen in dust. They will say, look, the moment when cars dipped underground, when people poured through this artery. They might call our present a sudden layer, a century of combustion turned into a thin seam of soot. Between the buried floors, the underground cities, and the thin lines of catastrophe, a pattern emerges. People endure by stacking. We choose to rise rather than scrape everything away, and that choice makes time legible in cross-section. So the next time you step down into a basement cafe, pause on the last stair. Imagine that once this doorway opened to the sun. Imagine that the table where you sit was once a courtyard where a child chased a dog. Imagine that one day your favorite street will be a cool, dark room. Someone will stand there and feel what you feel now, the presence of another floor of life, just out of reach, still warm in the earth. We are the latest layer. Build wisely. Thank you for watching.